Hi, I'm John Galliano, Senior Director of Biopharm Catalyst.
Hello, I'm Sheff, known as Sheff Station, a 20-year vet in trading biotech stocks.
And this is Biotech Bulls and Breakthroughs. Just a reminder that we are not a registered investment advisory firm, and the views on this podcast are not intended to be financial advice. Invest at your own risk. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Welcome once again to another episode of Biotech Bulls and Breakthroughs. We're excited to have Sheff back on. Sheff, welcome back. I know it's been about a month since we had you on. Hope you've had a great month. I know we've had a lot going on in the markets, but we're really excited to have you back. For everyone tuning in again, thanks again for supporting the podcast and our new endeavor here. And if this is your first listen, then welcome aboard. Sheff, obviously, one of the main things that's been top of mind, obviously, is the ASCO conference, and that's really, I think, what we want to focus on for at least the first half of the podcast today. And I did a kind of a brief mini podcast in between where I talked a little bit about some of the things that folks should be looking forward to for ASCO, some catalysts, and some just general topics, themes that they should be looking out for that were going to be covered at the conference. But for those of you who are not aware, ASCO is the largest oncology conference in the U.S., gathers over 40,000 oncology professionals. There's over 200 sessions, over 5,000 abstracts get released. And takes place from took place from May 30th through June 3rd in Chicago. Obviously there's a lot to talk about in the oncology space, but I guess just real quick, Sheff, backing up for a quick second, just for those who are listening who might be new to Catalyst and biotech trading in general, what are your thoughts on how you think about conferences? Like, obviously they're huge events for generating catalysts, but ASCO is clearly one of the biggest ones. Like, what are some of the other conferences that you look at, and how do you factor in some of these conferences into your your methodology and what you do when you're investing in biotech?
Absolutely. As far as the financial conferences, it's J.P. Morgan, but when you get into the scientific conferences, it's really ASCO is one of the biggest of the year. And, there's so many new agents that are being looked at. There's so many small and mid-cap companies that are being looked at. And in December, you have the American Society of Hematology, which is usually the second week in December. And then you also have the breast cancer meeting that is the largest, the San Antonio Breast Cancer Conference.
Yep.
And that is absolutely huge meeting. So usually in the middle of the year and at the end of the year, that's when you get the biggest data feeds for conferences. Obviously, there's conferences in between. There's international conferences that are big. There's EULAR,
Yep.
and there's other conferences, but ASH is definitely the granddaddy of them all.
Yeah, absolutely. Just out of curiosity, did you attend? I know you've attended some of them in the past. Did you attend ASCO this year?
I did not, but I did listen in on a lot of conference calls, and it's so nice now to be able to utilize these conferences and a lot of these one-on-ones, via via the internet and via live stream, and you can pick and choose what you want to go to because oftentimes those conferences are so big. At the McCormick Place in Chicago, it's really difficult to get to a lot of the conferences that
It's
you want to attend.
it's crazy. I was actually at it not this past year, but the year before, and it was just massive. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
huge hall. I mean, there's so many exhibitors that it almost ends up becoming overwhelming in terms of the value you can get out of it. To your point, now that everything is being done online and virtual, it's a much better way to kind of ingest the information, frankly, and be able to pick and choose a little bit more. Not to mention the cost of actually attending.
Absolutely. 100%. Definitely.
Um, but obviously, as a former oncology executive, I know you spent your career at Pfizer and Merck. This is obviously fairly near and dear to your heart, and one that you have extensive background and knowledge on. So again, we're super excited to have you on discussing this. I guess just kind of, you know, from a high level, you know, what were your kind of key takeaways from, when we're looking at when we're looking at oncology drugs and catalyst specifically? I guess first off, like what are you looking for specifically, and how does it differ, if at all, from any other indications? And then, what kind of played out at ASCO for you that was significant?
I think what played out, that's a great question. I think what played out initially was this, this Bristol Myers deal.
Yep.
BMY, Bristol Myers and into a co-development and co-commercialization with, you know, uh, BioNTech. And
Yep.
so is significant for this BNT 327, which is a PDL1 and a VEGF bispecific antibody. And this agreement offered Bristol Myers the optionality on a potential next generation immunology backbone therapy, which is going to offer greater benefits than Opdivo or Keytruda, which
Mm.
is significant because when you think of Keytruda as being the largest oncology um, drug in the world, it's pretty amazing that it has that kind of potential.
Yeah,
Um,
for
so
sure.
the, yeah, so it's pretty amazing. The development space is already crowded, which includes several PDL1s and PD1 VEGF bispecifics that are in development. But this commercialization, this unity between these two organizations definitely bolsters their competitive position. So that was a nice start to ASCO. And then, what we also saw is we saw, just a lot of we saw this emerging landscape in lung, breast, head and neck cancers, and then, novel RAS inhibitors. So that was really good to see. We saw Summit Therapeutics, ticker symbol SMMT. We saw them, present this Harmony data, suggesting that their drug could be the standard of care. Um, and so Evinacizumab, which is in lung cancer. So we're seeing all kinds of new agents as well. We saw uh, ticker symbol NUVA,
Yep.
which has or excuse me, NUVB, and they basically have a ROS1 TKI that is going to revolutionize the space in lung cancer for NGS testing, which is next generation sequence testing. Which, one of the things that we saw from ASCO is we're seeing more specificity when dealing in oncology. It used
Yep.
to be this general landscape of chemotherapy, but now with targeted agents and going after specific genetic mutations, we're seeing a lot of these smaller companies emerging, and the big companies starting to get an appetite for them.
Absolutely. And it's a couple things there that you brought up that I thought were super interesting. Obviously, the BMS deal. I mean, it's funny that right after JP Morgan, right, there was a lot of discussion around, how the environment was going to be ripe for deals and for M&A, and we kind of saw that slow down, and I alluded to that in the last podcast that I had. And actually, I was
Mhm.
at a summit where they were literally saying the exact same thing. I was at a summit in New York. It was the Financial Times US Pharma and Biotech Summit, and they were saying that, we haven't seen as many deals as we thought. And then sure enough, ASCO comes and you have this huge deal from BMS. So the environment still is there for some M&A, and it's interesting that we saw that play out right after there was some discussion around those deals not taking place. I think the Keytruda thing is really interesting, because it's kind of like you said. I mean, how many times do you really have like a true, I don't want to say, like, a true competitor, right, to that drug that can really play in that space? I mean, I just feel like that's something that needs to be really, really highlighted, and I think that it really can't be understated, how significant that is.
Exactly, especially with the size of both of these companies. I mean, it's you know they talked about, BioNTech, thinking there's significant upside, obviously with this BNT327, and that it just maximizes their opportunity with a PDL1 and a VEGF bispecific in this space. So we're seeing agents being used together that typically were used separately, and we're seeing how working together these companies are forming more opportunity for patients that suffer from lung disease and lung cancer, and have specific mutations that work on that specific cancer. So it's been pretty impressive. And again, as we talked about, I've mentioned NUVB, which is Nuvation Biosciences. Just the fact that they're going to be entering this space. They presented a subgroup analysis from their Trust 1-2 study, which highlighted consistent efficacy between Asian and non-Asian patients. And it sets the stage for them as they await regulatory approval on June 23rd, as a ROS, one inhibitor. But here's the interesting thing. They're going to be going into a space that, Pfizer has typically dominated.
Yeah,
Pfizer had the first ROS1 with crizotinib almost a decade ago. And I was fortunate enough to be part of that. But, we're going to see an opportunity where this space has a $600 million potential, and that when they do get approved, they're not only going to get approved, for first line, but second line indication as well. So what they're looking at on that June 23rd is having an agnostic approval, which is it's pretty impressive. The last company I saw do that was Merck with Keytruda, and one of the indications that they had for Keytruda at the time early on. But we're seeing more specificity with these oncology companies for sure.
absolutely. And just kind of backing up to the, I know I kind of asked like a two-part question there, but backing up to the first part of the question, just for the audience, I mean, when you're looking at and analyzing oncology drugs, specifically, or oncology companies that operate within the cancer space, like what are you looking for? How does that, differ at all from other indications? What are some of the key things folks should be paying attention to with respect to that?
I think new I think especially with regard to genetic sequencing,
Mm-hmm.
smaller companies that are getting in a space. Most big companies don't want to venture into phase 1 and phase 2 studies in areas that they think could potentially be small, or areas where they could invest a significant amount of money and then fail. That trial fails in
Yeah.
phase 2 and they lose all that money. So, a lot of the smaller companies, we saw Merus, MRUS. We saw BCAX. Both of those companies, Maris has a market cap now of almost $1 billion, or might be over $1 billion right now. I know it's $55 a share.
Yeah.
They released new data in squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck, so SCCHN, and that was considered an area that you know big companies typically don't venture into, but they're being looked at as a potential acquisition target because they had such promising data in that space. And then we saw BCAX, which had this same kind of data in that squamous cell carcinoma head and neck space. So I'm looking at smaller companies that are venturing into targeted areas of oncology that the bigger companies have not gone into, and those are just specific examples of two of those companies.
And it's a really good point, and it kind of segues into the one of the other questions that I wanted to address is, I mean, okay, so for some of those larger companies, I mean, are you, I guess, just high level, do you invest in some of the larger companies at all? Like, are you playing some of the bigger companies, some of the bigger pharma companies at all, or are you pretty much strictly talking about small cap, micro cap, nano cap, low float, that kind of thing?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's usually mid cap and lower because the big
yeah,
cap, the large caps, most of them are so mainstream in what they have in terms of products.
yeah,
So, the small cap are venturing, like all of the companies that I'm talking about, like BCAX, and Nuvation Bio, and a lot of those companies are. partnering with other companies. And like BCAX, their drug was being used with Keytruda. And same
Hmm.
with Maris, their drug for squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck was being used with Keytruda, which is owned by Merck. Merck has a market cap that's obviously, it's one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. But market caps of those companies are oftentimes 500 million or less, or they're in between the 500 million to a billion. So what I try to do is I try to stay in the 500 million to less in terms of market cap because there's significant upside potential, particularly if those companies end up getting bought out.
Yep. Yep.
Which if they have a good cap structure, they have a small float, they have small outstanding shares, they've got heavy on the cash. Those companies oftentimes have a lot of leverage versus with the bigger companies to potentially get bought out. So, and even real quick, another example is even looking outside of the oncology space. Just one example that recently happened was Vigil, ticker symbol VIGL. They got bought out. It's a neuroscience company. They got bought out by Sanofi. And that was a
Hmm.
company, it was another company, that they got bought out for $10 a share and they were $2 a share,
Yep.
$2.30. So their market cap went up significantly. But obviously they were in a space that, a company like Sanofi was not in terms of neuroscience. So particularly love to look at oncology companies that are venturing in that same space.
That.
Precision genetic medicine, precision testing,
Yep.
really specific so that when they get approved, there's no doubt whether an insurance company, approves their therapy for patients. And
Absolutely. And one thing that I think is interesting for the audience to kind of think about with respect to some of the bigger players is the role that they do have, right? So what you're describing is what you had mentioned is that you're looking at smaller companies that don't play in the same space as maybe some of the larger guys, but that also from that perspective there has to be some research that's done on the bigger players to really identify what spaces they're operating in, who the key players are, and then that will allow you to understand, okay, well, what are some of the other areas that are not currently being targeted by some of the bigger guys, right? So that from that perspective,
absolutely.
they play a role in this, and you may not invest in them, but they play a role in the research and how you're thinking about this space.
Absolutely. And one other point that you made that was an excellent point is that even when I was even looking at that Sanofi deal that they just bought out, the neuroscience company,
Yeah.
that they had been licensing and they had partnerships with them for the past 4 years.
Hmm.
Granted, they were smaller, but every year there was an increase in ownership of stock, so an increase in milestones that they were delivering to the company. And as the company continued to meet those milestones, even though the market cap was small, they decided that they were worth the purchase. But they originally had a relationship with a company. So oftentimes I also like to invest in these small cap and mid caps that already have established relationships with companies where they might partner on a clinical trial where that company will provide their drug for a clinical trial, or they'll participate with paying for the clinical trial,
Yep.
and giving the resources that they have to see if the drug ends up getting developed. So it's usually that early stage relationship that manifests itself to grow into a partnership or a potential buyout. And I think that's what we hope to see when we go to conferences like ASCO. And that's why
Yep.
that merger, or not necessarily merger, but that big deal with BioNTech and Bristol was so strong early on for ASCO.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, no, that's a great perspective, and that's super helpful. Just kind of switching gears, but still along the lines of ASCO. And I know that this is something that folks, you can't really have any conversation about any industry at all without having, some discussion around AI right now. And I know
Mhm.
some people get a little bit, tired of it, but it is here to stay, right? And when I mention AI, I'm really talking about the generative AI that we've seen within the last 3 years kind of boom. And that is certainly true within the pharma and the biotech space. I mean, how do you think about or I should say, do you think about AI and how some of these firms are leveraging it? How these biotechs are leveraging it, and are you factoring that into how you think about catalysts at all for these companies? Because I do know that that is something that is coming up. Is folks are kind of taking that next level and being like, okay, well, we want to understand which firms are kind of at the cutting edge of the technology side of it. Now, you'll hear from the pharma companies and the biotech companies that they're drug makers at the end of the day, right? They're not tech companies, but that technology will propel them to possibly get to the forefront of whatever indication they're targeting, whatever therapeutic area they're targeting. So like, how does that factor in at all for you, if it does at all?
No, it definitely does because you have a lot of companies that are using for drug development, they're using AI as their platform. Bigger companies don't want to put, millions of and billions of dollars into that space. So, you're looking at some of these smaller companies like Recursion Pharma, which has a platform that's I think that ticker symbol's RXRX. You have ABSI, which their ticker symbol's ABSI, but that's another one. You have, a lot of these companies that are using their platform to develop drugs, and bigger companies are watching to see what they do. AI, Tempest AI, a lot of the bigger companies have used it specifically in the medical field.
Mm-hmm.
Medtronic, Boston Scientific. One of the bigger ones that I've been following is as I mentioned, Tempest AI, which is that's a company that has really, they have a strong market cap, they have a solid platform with how they're with how they're developing their drugs right now. And so but it still is one that's particularly new when you look at it. It's just in the AI space, you're just, and that ticker symbol for Tempest is TEM. But that it's a company that is producing some revenue, and they're growing bigger and bigger. And I think that they're being used as the example of what a AI company in the biotech and the med space should look like.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's still relatively new, and so for me as an investor, I have really not delved too much into that space.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense. Well, I appreciate all of your thoughts and your input around ASCO. Just kind of switching gears a little bit to, we'll say, just general biotech and pharma, and just kind of your catalyst outside of ASCO. Um, what do you have currently on your watch list? I know we had a couple of players from the last watch list, that you had discussed. But anything new that you're taking a look at, over the course of the next several months, the next quarter?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because a lot of these catalysts are starting to take shape and develop. We had one, we talked about BCLI,
Yep.
which had an IND that was a month out. And that stock at the time was, $1.15, $1.20. And they ended up getting an IND, and they the next morning pre-market they were about 260, so they were up over 100%. Again, it was an opportunity in a for a company that has an IND but has a small float and a small number of outstanding shares to make a solid move. That move generated over 3 or 4 days, and of course, as always, some these stocks, you hear these news, stock retreats and falls back. So that was one we looked at. The other one we looked at was Palisade Bio, which had
Yep.
strong data. They had reported positive phase 1A results in their drug for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And, the drug, had a nice pop on that news and did really well. And the ones that we're waiting on are still some of the ones that they have data upcoming, but it's ICCM.
Yep.
Um,
We
you
talked
know,
about that one the last time.
yeah, we talked about that last time. And in terms of new ones, there's INBS, which INBS is expecting. A 510(k) approval in July, August timeframe, which again, that's technology that's using the fingerprint. They're not using blood
Yep.
or saliva, so it's definitely a new way to detect. for fingerprinting. And so that's a revolutionary change. They've already got a lot of partnerships with companies, has a small market cap, but it's one that I really like. The one that they gave a specific time frame for in June, which was updated at their recent call, was Nyxoah, which is NYXH. They specifically, most of the time on these 510(k) approvals, they don't give a timeline, but they reinforce that their manufacturing facility has already passed inspection. Um, they've answered all the questions from the FDA, and
Yeah.
that they clearly expect that they're going to be receiving approval at the end of June.
Hmm.
So, or before the end of June, at the end of the second quarter. So, typically, when we have PDUFAs that have hard dates, it's easier to track than a
Yep.
lot of times these medical companies. But when they give you a hard time frame, it clearly means that they're right at the end, before they get approval. So that company has a small float. It's got 13 million in the float, 37 million shares outstanding. They have a device for chronic sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea. So that's a space. Again, looking at spaces where there is a definitive need, where there's opportunity as an investor to do well on an investment. And Nyxoah has a lot of key players involved with them in terms of big funds. RA Capital and a few other funds have really taken to them, and so that's one I really like. And then the other ones, there is also a few new ones. CMPS, which they've got 6-week top line data in late June, and so in treatment resistant depression. So they're in the psychedelic space, and they're definitely a leader in that space. I mean, we've seen more coverage of that space. And I think we're going to see more analysts covering that space, and so CMPS is definitely one that's going to have data that I just started tracking. Um, there's one in July that's going to have data, specific time frame in July, which is it's called Wintree, ticker symbol WINT, and they've already had seismic A, seismic B studies that have been successful. They have a seismic C cardiogenic shock interim analysis results that are expected in July. Um, the stock, yesterday, it took a little bit of a hit. It was in the mid 70s. It took a hit because they said they were going to start allowing for crypto um, as a form of payment, and they are using it to increase revenue. But it doesn't take away from the fact that they have clinical trial data coming up that, in a space, a cardiogenic shock, where, if that data, reads out positive, it's gonna have a significant effect on their market cap. So that's another one. And the one I've talked about before, Nuvation Bio, is one that I own.
Yep. Yeah, you mentioned
And
that one a few times. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and so so I like that. The other one, Azitra, which we've talked about. Now, see, QNRX. I talked about two drugs being used in the Netherton syndrome space, and Azitra has data at the end of June in 12 patients. It's a phase one that is basically going to focus on safety and tolerability, and they're also going to cover some efficacy measures as well. But they have an extremely small market cap. They're one of only two companies in this space. Obviously, QNRX, they're the other big gorilla in terms of Netherton. Um, but their stock I think is around $9. Oh, there we go. It's around $9.
Yep.
So those are the two companies in that space, and I really like that for June. June is going to be definitely a busy month for a lot of these plays.
Yep.
Um, I did want to mention PharmaThere, which I've talked about. I talked about on the last one. I talked about this one. They had an update. In the update, they had a PDUFA, and that's PHRRF. they had a PDUFA date in June. That was in late June, and the FDA said that they needed to extend the date, which extensions are great to see, because if they weren't comfortable with the data, or if they really needed to revise what was in the NDA, they would just give them a complete response. But the fact that they extended it to June, or excuse me, to August 9th, um, shows that they're on track to get ketamine approved in surgical pain.
Yeah,
And I
and
think
it's interesting because it's a really good point, because I think when, especially when you're talking about approvals and PDUFAs, right, and priority reviews, I think sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you have to really look under the hood a little bit more, to your point about like an extension, or if a company, let's say, like if they already had a complete response letter, right, or if they just needed to adjust one aspect of the data, right, or there was one thing that the FDA didn't like, right. So when you actually look under the hood, that might have been the reason why they were issued a complete response letter or whatever, they just had to fix it. Then you can, it's not a guarantee, but you have a lot more of a likelihood on that next one that it actually is going to get approved, right?
absolutely, absolutely, and the FDA is a tough nut to crack, as we've
Yeah.
seen over the years. And so anytime you get communication, solid communication with them, it's very positive.
Yeah.
UNCY, Unicisive, I talked about that in the last one, but the reason that's important is because we are in June. We've seen that. That's one I own. We saw that when I was talking about it. That was at 59.60 cents. And they're at 80 cents right now, so they're up 33% over the past day, or excuse me, 3 to 4 days. And I think they're trying to get over $1 before their PDUFA date of August, or excuse me, of June 28th. So they are in the chronic kidney disease space. Being their drug is used 3 times a day versus some of these other ones which are 8 times a day, like
Mm.
fosrenol. Right now, they're covered by what's the big Piper, and Piper has said that they've pretty much they're using the 505(b)(2) submission. So they're basically they don't have to do new clinical trials. They just have to show they're comparable to what's out there. And so that's a huge market. And right now, with their market cap being as low as it is, there's significant upside there. Another one is Vanny. Last time we talked about um, GLP-1 agonists, and Vanny is a drug and a device, and they have data that's going to be reading out the Liberate One clinical trial study. That's basically, it's a pharmacokinetic study, but it's a study that's going to help them address the dose, the proper doses that they need for their phase 3 study. So they may have a couple of patients where they look at efficacy, but I think the fact that that's in the GL1 piece or GLP-1 space, could really it could really be a game changer for them. When that June data comes out. So I like that one as well. Another one that I had on here is that is a smaller cap, more of a micro cap, is IXHL. And IXHL, they have a pill for sleep apnea, chronic obstructive
Mm.
sleep apnea. And what they did recently is they gave an update to investors a few weeks ago, and the stock ran from 8 cents to $1. It pulled back, and then what they did subsequently in the 20 cent range, when it retraced, is they canceled a significant number of warrants. They did that twice. They canceled the Class A warrants, which could have significantly diluted the shareholder base once news comes out in July, which is expected, and that news is expected to help propel them to a phase 3 study. But having a pill that can cure chronic obstructive sleep apnea is significant. And so it's a micro cap. Obviously, these are high risk stocks.
Yeah.
So, it's really important that investors know that. But it's also a stock that is doing the right things. I think a lot of times these smaller stocks don't have, proper share structures. This one has, canceled the share structure, of warrants being outstanding twice, knowing that they have July data upcoming. So that's a significant catalyst for July data. Um, Another stock that has breakthrough designation, I should have put it on my list. They have a PDUFA date of July 22nd, is Replimune, ticker symbol REPL. And this stock is a stock that when you were talking about, it's a stock that is a mid cap that has a key inflection point, for their RP1 plus PD1 combo in patients who have failed PD1 for melanoma. So
Mm.
it's in that melanoma space.
Yeah.
They have priority review, they have breakthrough designation, and the FDA. There's been no hiccups in their submission to
Yeah.
the FDA. So I really like that setup into July. I know we've talked a lot about the June catalyst, but that one
Yeah.
into July is solid. Um, and then one other one I want to talk about is two other ones. AQST, they're expecting acceptance from the FDA in July. So I thought it was June. It's in July. They just restated that they're expecting that in July. So that could have a significant bump once they get an NDA acceptance and then they get their PDUFA date. So that's one to look at. Small market cap. The other one is. We talk about, and you specifically had mentioned this when we were talking about, what I look for in the cancer space,
Yep.
and this is Artello Biosciences. That's ARTL, and they have data coming up for one of their drugs. It's basically in fatty acid binding protein, which is a new class of drug, a new class of therapies, and it works in all different in different disease states. But the one that where they have July data is for their drug for cachexia and weight loss in people from sorry about that, who have suffered from um, weight loss due to chemotherapy. So Artello, low float, another one that has cash on balance, but with solid data, I think that can really move the stock there. And it's a niche space that no one else is in the cancer space. So I like that one.
That's great, Jeff. As per usual, that was a tremendous amount of information and really awesome. I really appreciate it, and I know our audience does too. I think that is probably all we have time for on today's podcast. I assume that was all you wanted to cover, correct, Chef?
Yep, that's it.
Okay,
That's it.
great. Well, as usual, like I
Thank
said,
you.
thank you so much for all of that. We really appreciate it. For everyone on the call or who's listening on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, we appreciate the support for Biotech Bulls and Breakthroughs. We hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to our channel, like, comment, send us an email to let us know what else you want to hear about. And also, if you have the means, please donate to Chef's Fund. We have that listed on our website, www.biofarmcatalyst.com/podcast. And we really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to having you back on next month, Chef. And we'll likely have, maybe one or two other kind of mini episodes in between there to talk about some other stuff that's going on in the market. So we really
That's
appreciate it.
great. Yeah, I really appreciate the listeners, John. I appreciate the questions. I just appreciate this engagement in terms of how we can continue to
Yeah,
help investors to do better in the market.
it's
And
great. It's great. We've
yes,
got people seem to be really liking it. So we'll keep it up. So thanks so
absolutely.
much, Jeff.
Thank you. Have
All
a
right.
great day, everyone.
Yep.
Bye bye.